So our next presenter will be talking about the contradictory and complex nature of masculinity and violence, interconnectedness among men with cumulative lifetime violence histories. Sue O'Donnell, PhD, RN, is an associate professor and associate dean of research and graduate studies at the University of New Brunswick, Faculty of Nursing. Her research interests broadly include violence, workplace bullying, gender, health, sickness, absence, knowledge mobilization, qualitative, grounded theory, and mixed methods research. She is particularly interested in the intersection between violence and gender for men. She's also interested in the use of evidence-based online resources, including film as a medium for knowledge mobilization. So thank you, Sue, for joining us today.
Thank you, Sheila. Just going to get myself set up here. Thank you. And I just need this. So as mentioned, the focus of my discussion today, or my talk, will be the contradictory and complex nature of masculinity's violence, interconnectedness among men with cumulative lifetime violence history. So I want to begin by introducing members of our team. So this is our team here. I'll be talking a little bit more about the broader study that this qualitative study is a part of, which involves the team members here, which include myself, Dr. Patria Taylor, who will be also sharing qualitative data from this study later this afternoon. Charlene Vincent is a registered nurse and also a research assistant that has a long history with our team. Some of you may recognize Dr. Judith Wiest. Dr. Judith Wiest has been a mentor for all of us on the team, really, but has a long-standing history of doing a lot of work looking at women's experiences of IPV. And then we also have Jeannie Malcolm, who we have been very fortunate to have as our research program coordinator and program manager for 18 years now. So we work hard to make sure we have funding for her position. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about this study, as mentioned, that this falls within a broader study. As you can see on the screen here, and I guess I'll begin by sharing, maybe to begin, that we on this team have a long history of doing research with women who've experienced many forms of violence, but in particular intimate partner violence. So it was a very big shift for us to turn our attention towards looking at violence experiences among men. But we did this because we know violence is very pervasive in the lives of boys and men who are targets and or perpetrators of violence in many contexts across their lifespan. And I would say that historically, there has been a reluctance among researchers and other key stakeholders to acknowledge and address men's experiences of violence, really for fear of minimizing or detracting from women's experiences. And this is really important because we do know that women are disproportionately impacted by violence that is most often perpetrated by men. So I'd really like to begin our talk by situating our understanding of women's experiences of violence and really how it links to men's experiences and why it's important to look at this. And so for us as a team, looking at women's experiences of IPV over time, we really started to recognize that without really turning attention to looking at men's experiences of violence, it will be very difficult to solve this problem of violence. And so we really feel like it's a critical part of the solution towards ending violence. So really this situates our work on the men's violence gender and health study that I'll be talking about. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about cumulative lifetime violence. And again, this isn't something I'll talk a lot about throughout the qualitative data. However, I did want to share with the team that, as I mentioned in the introduction, men are targets and or perpetrators of many forms of violence across the lifespan. And so as a team, we've also been recognizing that it's very common that researchers do research looking at a particular type of violence, so maybe childhood violence, adolescent or dating violence, IPV at particular points across the lifespan. But what we recognize is that many individuals experience multiple forms of violence across the lifespan. And so what we were recognizing as a team is that our theoretical understanding and the research that exists really does demonstrate this, but that our measures or tools aren't sort of caught up with this understanding. So as a team, we've undertaken a very ambitious goal of trying to develop an actual measure to measure cumulative lifetime violence. And in this attempt, what we're looking at is trying to capture experiences of violence from childhood through to adulthood in a range of contexts and a range of types of forms of violence. So this is also part of the study, the Men's Violence Gender Health Study that I'm talking about. Neither Patria or I will be talking about the measure today, but we do have papers that are written on the measure that other members of the team have been leading. So I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that, but I think it's important to begin by helping you understand that this is a concept that we're very interested in and that we were looking at as a part of this study. So then, this provides you a bit of information about the study context and design for the Men's Violence Gender Health Study. So it was a mixed method study. It was funded by the CIHR. It was focused on understanding the links between cumulative lifetime violence using our new measure, gender and health among men. So it may not have been clear when I introduced the team, but all of us have backgrounds as registered nurses with the exception of Jeannie. So we have done research looking at the link between violence and health is of primary interest to us. So we did undertake with the CIHR funding a quantitative study that was a community convenience sample of men who were invited to complete an online survey. Interestingly, we decided that men ought not have to have violence experience to participate. So any person who identified as a man could complete the survey. We were able to recruit 685 Atlantic Canadian men to participate in and complete this survey. And even though violence experience wasn't a criteria for inclusion, interestingly, violence was very prevalent. And we found that across the sample, more than 80% had violence experience as both target and perpetrator. So again, another important component, but yet complex component of the work is that we need to be looking at experiences not just as target or perpetrator, but recognizing that people can have both those experiences. For the qualitative study that I'll be talking with you about today, we purposefully sampled from the larger sample. So when we recruited men to complete the online survey, we asked whether or not they'd be interested in being contacted to potentially complete a qualitative interview. And of those people who said yes, we gained a qualitative sample for the study that I'll be focusing on today. We did certainly look at criteria for inclusion in the qualitative sample was that men had violence experience. Remember, I said not everyone had to have violence experience. We were interested in talking specifically with men with violence experience. So to situate a little bit then this qualitative study, I think it's important that we begin by recognizing that cultural, institutional, and societal gender expectations are embedded in communities. They're embedded in life experiences of boys and men that really influence what people think about and ideals around what it means to be a man. And so such norms and expectations then do influence gender socialization. And certainly this begins at a very young age and continues through to adulthood. And for those of you who haven't done a lot of thinking about this, and maybe some of you have it, or at least you're aware of it because of the media, we know that dominant views about what it means to be a man reflect ideals such as things like risk-taking, self-reliance, prioritizing work, emotional control, and having power over women. So we also know that even though these ideals are often unattainable, boys and men do experience pressure to meet these dominant masculine ideals. So this is well established in the literature and was informing our interest in trying to look at then, what is the link between violence and gender for men, knowing that risk-taking behaviors, control, violent behaviors are ones that boys and men are socialized around. And I guess I'm bringing myself into this next slide, where we do see that violence is one way that men and boys can demonstrate masculinity, and that socialization to suppress emotions and vulnerability can compel some men and boys to express their emotions in other ways through aggression or violence. We've also seen evidence to suggest that men that endorse more traditional masculine beliefs have had more problems in relationships with women. And this is seen in things like perpetrating IPV and or sexual violence. So of course, not all men, but we have seen some links that exist there. We also know that men who are targets sometimes reciprocate or perpetrate violence as a way of preserving their masculinity. So research, as I've mentioned already, we know tends to focus less on men's experiences in general, but often if it is, it's looking at those particular types of experiences at particular points in time. So we then have been interested in looking at what is the experience for men who have experienced or histories of cumulative lifetime violence and gender. So this brings us to the study purpose, which was to examine the complex relationship between gender and violence for men who've experienced cumulative lifetime violence from the perspective of their own lived experience. And, you know, this fit with broader study aims. When we said we wanted to collect qualitative data as part of this mixed method study, we really wanted to be able to contextualize and understand key study variables, one of which was gender, because we have tended to approach our research with the social determinants of perspective, social determinants of health perspective, recognizing gender as an important social determinant. So this brings us then to the actual sample of men who participated in the qualitative component of the research. We did 32 individual interviews with men. Of those, we found that most experienced CLV as both perpetrator and target, 4 as target only, and none were perpetrator only. The average age of our sample was 43 years, but they ranged in age from 19 to 64. Most men that agreed to take part in interviews were married or living with a partner and identified as heterosexual, so not a lot of sexual diversity in the sample. Most had some form of post-secondary education. Looking at employment, 40% were employed, 21 unemployed, and 18 retired. Half of the annual income less than $25,000 Canadian, so you know, lower income for sure among the sample. 43% lived in rural or small towns, so about, you know, half living in rural areas, but also the others living in urban areas. So we used a qualitative, interpretive, descriptive approach. So this is similar for those of you that are qualitative researchers. We think about kind of basic descriptive analysis, generating themes. So this takes it a step further to look at interpreting those themes. Just to give you a bit of information, oh, I'm moving the slides on my own computer, but not the screen. Sorry about that. We engage people in semi-structured one-on-one qualitative interviews that happened in person or on the phone. Those lasted between 21 and 89 minutes in length. Researchers and participants, as a part of our interpretive descriptive approach, really did engage in an interactive examination of the issues to create understanding of their experiences. Research questions and our work really as a team aim to move beyond basic description to look at interpretation, as I already mentioned. And using this approach involved reading transcripts line by line, coding data into broad units of meaning, assigning labels. Our team worked really independently, but that we came together often for meetings to talk about emerging themes and our interpretations of those. And it's been one of the funnest teams that I've had an opportunity to work on. Really, Dr. Petria, Taylor, Charlene, and I, we met a lot and had a lot of discussions about the data. You know, common to interpretive description, asking questions like, what is happening here? Why is this here? Why not something else? So if we look at kind of what are the primary themes that emerged, and as I mentioned, Petria will be talking about some health related data that came through in the qualitative data. So lots of information there. We had probes around the impact of cumulative lifetime violence on health, but for this component of the work, we were really interested in trying to understand what was being said about gender. So what we saw when we looked at the data and began to generate themes was that gender and violence, or gender and masculinity, were linked to violence in ways that not only informed their views about what it means to be a man, but also their use of violence. And the interconnectedness of gender and violence was something that for us as a team was very striking and stood out very clearly. So the interrelationship that exists then between gender and violence, we labeled masculinities and violence interconnectedness, or as we tend to say, MV interconnectedness. And really what this MV interconnectedness represents is the complex connection between gender and violence, and one that is actually very difficult to separate due to other themes that we identified, which is the normalization and acceptance of violence among boys and men. We also noted that there's a tension that arises when men try to really separate, or they begin thinking about and try to separate the link between violence and gender. And this we defined as the paradox, because for many men, they want to disconnect this link between gender and violence, but it's very difficult due to this persistent normalization and acceptance. Charlene pulled up some of this. So she's our qualitative researcher that loves numbers as well. So she works across both sides of the team. But within our qualitative data, she found it really, or qualitative data, she found it really interesting to note that, and she actually assigned a number to this, that when we asked men about violence, they tended to talk about physical violence. And we see this often, that without sort of being able to give people broad definitions of violence, they might not identify themselves as targets and or perpetrators. So consistent with what we've seen in other literature, you know, people really attach the idea of violence to physical violence. We asked men to define violence for us, so to help us understand how they see violence. So of course, as mentioned, they talked about physical violence. They found it very difficult, some of them, to really express this clearly, but with probing, men were able to discuss violence more broadly, especially focusing on some of the other emotional types of violence that they experienced across their lifespan, both as a target and a perpetrator. And generally speaking, I would say that men define violence as action to threaten or cause harms to another person, object, or self. The other thing that we found really interesting is that we did have an interest in probing men around what what they understood gender to be. And this proved to be a challenging question to ask men. So we asked things like, you know, how do you see yourself as a man? We said, can you tell me about any experiences where what was expected of you was different than how you wish to be a man? Like we spent a lot of time as a team kind of adjusting our questions around gender, and it was something that men had difficulty talking about. They didn't have difficulty talking about gender in general. Oh, sorry, I forgot to advance the slide. So when we asked them, like, can you describe gender and what it means to be a man, they could describe it very easily based on, you know, sort of gender stereotypes and what people often link to what we see as men. So characteristics such as being heroic, macho, strong, tough, assertive, confident, stoic, and calm. They talked about behaviors such as being a provider, helping people, not sharing emotions. But then when we asked them about their own gender, that was a little bit more difficult for them to express. And what we learned is that their you know, expressions of and understanding of gender for themselves was really revealed in their descriptions and interactions with the interviewers. So then we'll begin by sharing this concept or theme that emerged of masculinities and violence interconnectedness. So as mentioned, you know, really we saw that violence and gender are interconnected in very complex ways, in that gender is influenced by violence and violence experience is also influenced by gender. Certainly we saw that this is shaped by social influences and pressures that reinforce violence as a normal and acceptable part of being a man. And as mentioned already, this is highly linked to the normalization and acceptance of violence that we see as being very common in these men's lives who have had persistent violence experiences across the lifespan. Interestingly, masculinity's violence interconnectedness can generate reward for men and can contribute to their sense of self. So as one individual said, I think going through the whole broken jaw stuff, it definitely helped my street cred. While in high school, it made a lot of people not mess with me sort of thing, which was helpful, I suppose. Someone else said, I didn't get bullied when I was at the beginning of grade school, partially because I was smaller, but then I befriended someone who was quite large and that helped. And then eventually I ended up fighting back against the bullies and that kind of stopped it. It did lead me to obviously become violence towards other people, but in the end, it prevented further abuse. So you can see here the interconnectedness that we're seeing between violence and gender and that expectation to use violence either in retaliation or as a way of protecting oneself and others. So although it can generate reward, this connection between gender and violence, it can also result in significant harm. So this individual said it was purpose-driven to demonstrate and bend people to my will, and that's clear. At the time, it never bothered me because I was trying to be manly, tough, ridiculous swagger. But after sobriety, I started looking at these things. And I remember at one point, it was a domination to bend somebody to my will. So really that sense of control that even with my ex, when we had it at my worst, she left after an episode of violence. So we see that, exerting some of those characteristics or trait, or I don't want to use the word trait, that are typically aligned with traditional masculine norms can certainly result in harm. So to further our understanding of normalization of violence, it often begins at a young age, and we certainly saw that reflected in the transcripts, and it persists throughout the lifetime. Early exposure to violence can inform ideas about the role of men in relationships, homes, and communities. So for some men, violence really was so commonplace for the participants that it was seen as the norm. So someone said here, it's not that I don't want to, I don't know how to, because violence has been a part of my life before I was even able to work. Because of the, excuse me, sexual abuse from my grandmother that my brother and I went through. Like I said, we grew up in a town where fighting between boys was the norm, and I went into the army where fighting was the norm too. Going to war, you're fighting, you're killing, who knows? I never even thought my whole life what other type of job I would do. I was just born a soldier, end of story. And like I said, I'd still be there if I could. So, this is just one example, but this was commonly reflected where, men in the study talked about having persistent and frequent exposure to violence across their lifespan, as, is reflected here. And that it just, I guess, influenced their view of what normalcy is around violence. So on the whole, we saw and interpreted that normalization and acceptance of violence was also influenced by social pressures, and really those pressures around what it means to be a man. Violence was acceptable under circumstances where men were threatened, if vulnerable others were in danger, or in work-related instances such as the one described on the previous slide. Even among men who resisted violence, some felt compelled to use violence in certain situations simply because they were men. So this gets at not only the normalization, but also that interconnectedness that can be difficult to disentangle. Normalization really does then reinforce masculinities and violence interconnectedness. So this then brings us to the idea of the paradox. Sorry. I've lost my place, which we described as a contradictory nature of MV interconnectedness, and that tension that arises when men begin to think about and see the link between gender and violence, its related impacts, and most importantly, their desire to separate violence from how they define themselves or see themselves as men. And we labeled that complexity and that tension that arises as the paradox. So one person said, I can specifically recall memories where the option of being aggressive was available, either by peer pressure or anything like that, where you're supposed to stand up, get aggressive, insert yourself in there by threatening with violence, like a fight coming on or something like that. And me shying away from it because I didn't want to do that. And it conflicts so hard because you have an expectation to be that way, at least in the certain moment, like at the center, you know, so it's difficult because you almost feel guilty. And in the next quote, someone said, I don't know, a part of me still thinks that the man should be tough, like the stereotypical male sort of ideal, you know, tough and quiet and hardworking, you know, the scrapper, the baller, that kind of thing. And it conflicts with that side of me that is very, you know, needs human contact at some point. And I think this is also a significant quote, so we decided to include this one here, which reflects again that contradictory nature of envy and interconnectedness and the paradox. Because of all the incidents that happened, like my mother being beaten, I'm 8 years old, I got brushed aside like I was a mosquito. And since my father died, my mom kept telling me, well, you're the man of the family, and how does a man protect his family if he gets brushed aside like a mosquito? So that there's this unresolved guilt and shame that would keep coming out. So again, there's those feelings of, you know, shame and the potential harm for men for really disentangling masculinities and violence, not feeling as though they're living up to what people expect of them. So we did see in our data that men began to grapple with this paradox in the ways that gender and violence have influenced their lives. And when they do that, they're better able to imagine and move towards separating or disconnecting violence towards how they define themselves as men. But let me tell you, it's not easy. This person said, well, the way I used to think being a man would be somebody that could punch everybody up and down the road and everybody's scared of you, running away from you. But, you know, I don't know. I look at it as being a man and violence shouldn't be together anymore anyway. Like we're in a new millennium here. So if I just even type of violence, it's not just any type of violence is even not manly. So as reflected here, certainly men were thinking about gender and its link to violence. As mentioned at the beginning, you know, when we asked them about the links between gender and violence for them, it was difficult for them to talk about that directly, but certainly they're revealed in quotes like this. And so to conclude, we think that this idea of the paradox is an important understanding and addition to the literature in that it really is helping us to begin to think about and shine a light on how men may reject the narrative that masculinity and violence are interconnected. I don't think that we're talking about that very often, and yet, you know, we're persistently socializing men and boys to act in ways that reflect violence. Masculinity, violence, interconnectedness demonstrates that the link between masculinity and violence perpetration certainly isn't straightforward. So on the one hand, you know, men don't want to reject this connectedness, but they also feel compelled and really pressured by people around them, including family members, coworkers, to use violence in order to be, you know, contribute to their own sense of self as men or boys. Normalization and acceptance of violence calls for efforts to counteract the messages and pressures that boys and men receive that influence their behavior, and really in particular those messages that still exist around what it means to be a boy or man and some of those very traditional beliefs about that. So that concludes our presentation. We have been working on a paper for this that we've just submitted for peer review, so it's not published yet.